please join me in welcoming Director Pratibha Parmar and Karen Thompson, Chair of USC's Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies.
Thank you.
So before we begin our conversation, I believe Pratibha wants to share a few notes of thanks and acknowledgement.
Given this is our LA premiere, first of all, I really want to thank the Hammer Museum and particularly Claudia and Shannon for their hard work in putting this screening together. I also want to thank Ken Batchelor, who's here in the audience, who was our music supervisor and associate producer. And as you can tell from the music in the film, I was very ambitious in the kind of music I wanted, and it wasn't always easy to get those tracks cleared. And Ken just gave it his all and was just spectacular. So thank you, Ken. A huge mega thanks to one of our executive producers, Amy Shoulder, who's here in the audience. Thank you, Amy, so much for your absolute and total commitment to us as the filmmakers and taking us through to the end. The film took about 7 years to make, and towards the end of that period, both Shaheen Haque, who's the producer, and myself were just pretty exhausted, and Amy came in and helped us through the last legs. And Amy's worked her magic, and we have finally got a distributor for the film, and it will be streaming and online early next year through a distributor called Oscilloscope. And so please watch out for the film going online early next year. Last but not least, I want to thank Shaheen Haque, who's the producer, who absolutely she worked 16-hour days. She wore multiple hats, was the production designer, was the archive producer, archive researcher, and whenever I had some moments of I just can't do this anymore, it's too bloody hard, she'll be like, no, just one bit more, let's just get over the next few weeks. And so she really kind of sustained me throughout the process. So thank you for giving me the time to say thanks. And thank you all for coming this evening. I understand that LA is really difficult to drive around in and get around in, so I really appreciate you all here.
So I guess now we'll begin our conversation and have a chance to, bask in the glow of all of that gratitude to talk about this incredible film that you made. And, my first question really is just to invite you to talk about its origins insofar as far as I know, that you weren't necessarily invested in Dworkin as a figure. She was sort of someone in the ether, obviously, that you'd encountered in different ways. But in what ways were you induced to make this project? And how is that sort of atypical from how you usually go about selecting the subjects for your features?
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, Andrea Dworkin was never in my sightlines. My genealogy is, as a feminist, is really my foundations in reading the writings of women of color feminists like Alice Walker, June Jordan, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Gloria Anzaldúa, Cherry Morago. And so I never, Andrea Dworkin I knew of, but I never really would have considered making a film on her. And what happened was that I got approached by two very kind of straight industry film, TV industry producers in the UK, and they had seen the documentary I'd made on Alice Walker, which had been broadcast on BBC. And they asked me if I would be interested in making a film on Andrea Dworkin. And I was like really intrigued because here were these two very straight guys interested in making a film on Andrea Dworkin. And I was so I met with them, and they were well-meaning, but I didn't particularly agree with the approach that they were taking. So I said, good luck, guys, and thank you, but no thanks. And they said, well, how would you do it? And I said I would need to go back and read Andrea Dworkin because I realized I hadn't read a lot of her work. So I went back and I read quite a few of her books, and two books in particular, Mercy, which is an autofiction, and Heartbreak, her memoir. I read those two books, and I was just completely kind of taken by her writing, her use of language, and also this kind of story of a woman who really wanted to be a writer. That was her ambition. Was her desire. And then all these different things happened, which kind of she had to fight against in order to be who she wanted to be, which is a writer. And also, I kind of saw how, well, at the beginning, actually, of one of those two books, in the front of the book, she had this quote from the French writer Rimbaud, which says, "Je suis un autre, I am another." And so she kind of had this really acute awareness of her, the different sides of who she was, how she was perceived. And then in some of my other research in it, while I was researching it, I came across a quote from the European cultural critic, John Berger, whose work I really admired and respected. And he said that Andrea Dworkin was one of the most misrepresented writers of the 20th century. And I kind of could see what he was saying as I began to, investigate and go deeper. So that was one quote. And then the other quote was from Leonard Cohen. And Leonard Cohen was on tour and he was being interviewed for Rolling Stone. And there's a photograph with the interview. And he's sitting on his hotel bed. And he has Intercourse, the book, Andrea's book, on the bed alongside him. And so the interviewer says, what are you doing reading this kind of, radical, man-hating, lesbian, feminist? And Leonard Cohen had this really beautiful response to it, and it's too long for me to remember it. But he said something like, the writing in this book is the kind of writing that challenges long-held beliefs that we have taken for granted for millennia, and that by the questioning of these beliefs, she is forcing us to think of how the world could be different. And he said it is this kind of revolutionary thinking that can bring about new worlds. And so, here are these two guys who I respect and who are really expansive thinkers who are saying these things about Andrea Dworkin. And so I just began to kind of read and, more of her work. And I just got very excited by her writing and its relevance to the present moment. And I think that was what it was its relevance to now.
Well, and it's fascinating that, in your response that you call forward the kind of unlikely readers or suspects, who would bring you to Dworkin's world and bring you closer to her writing. And there are a couple of things that, came out in your response. You referenced, obviously, the notion of autofiction, but also that powerful desire to be a writer. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think that the film brought to the fore was that, Dworkin's desire to write in a particular way and in such a way that would demand attention and that would induce notice and, provocation, care, whatever it was. It could not escape, attention and engagement in whatever way. And I'm wondering, to what extent you might describe your own practice or process in creating this film and in working through Dworkin's own desires, writerly desires in that way. To what extent did it affect your formal approach to this project, right? How did that level of provocation make its way into, your effort to represent to us this figure who many had taken for granted in certain scripts?
Well, I think, it resonated for me that her risk taking, she talks about wanting to be a writer who takes risks, is original, in the same way that she compares it to the music of Bach. And that's the kind of writer she wants to be. And she is a provocative writer, and she was a provocative writer. And she's got her body of work is just a really kind of, there's all kinds of experimental formal approaches in different books. But I think it resonated for me. But my body of work from the get-go has been about risk-taking. I've taken creative risks with every single film that I've made. And so for me, it wasn't anything like, okay, so she's taking risks in her writing, so I'm going to, take risks with for my formal approach. I think the approach to this story and the storytelling was that I wanted to use, I didn't want it to be literal. I wasn't interested in making a kind of linear biography. I wanted her story and this single story to open out into larger territories, to open out into bigger stories, other stories, not bigger stories, but other stories. So that, this was not just her story, but her story in the ways in which it kind of actually is the story of many women globally. Child sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, rape, all of these things that happened to Andrea are stories of many women around the world. And so I kind of didn't want to, I wanted to use her story, a single story, and broaden it out to speak to other women's stories too.
Well, that brings me to, well, first of all, that's evocative of that line that struck me just seeing it again this evening about how a nightmare doesn't unfold in a linear way, right? In her own writing. But that brings me to a question actually that, people asked me, knowing that I was going to speak to you about your film before I even had a chance to see it, and that is about the narrators, about the avatars who are a part of this process of telling Andrea's story across this sort of, nonlinear timeline. And so I just wanted to ask about that particular choice, about, what drove that effort to put her words, which are very powerful, and that which she speaks herself, but alongside others speaking them, about like figures, some recognizable, others maybe less so, or in niche circles. Can you talk a little bit about, the different Andreas, the proliferate Andreas in this film?
I think my starting point was that because I wanted Andrea's words to be the words that were spoken in the film. I was very clear in my directorial intent that I did not want to make a traditional documentary with talking heads and didactic kind of commentary who Andrea Dworkin was. I really wanted to move away from that, to speak, to use her words and for her to be the narrator of her own story. And my choice of sort of, the actors was, it just was, apart from Amandla Stenberg, who was brought to me by a casting director, every other actor in the film is through a personal contact or through a contact through one of our EPs, Gloria Steinem. And all the women who are in the film, all the actresses, each and every one of them have said that they're very aligned with the issues and the themes of the film. Not all of them knew who Andrea Dworkin was, but given that the theme of the film is centering violence against women and revealing that and illuminating that, and showing the outrage and the anger that Dworkin had, all the actresses that we had felt that they personally were invested. So it wasn't a job for them. It was something that, and it couldn't be a job for them because we paid them, really basic minimum SAG-AFTRA rates. It was a very low budget film. So, they had to have some kind of commitment to the actual film and what the film was trying to do. And I think that for me, it was just, there was absolutely never an intention to do a literal, like find lookalikes or anything like that, because, going back to my earlier point, I kind of wanted to open it up. I wanted to open up her story to other stories, other women's stories. And one of the things that I think I hadn't thought about, but that's sort of come up in sort of from feedback that we've had at different screenings, is that this point that somebody made, that is it that we as audiences look at and are able to enter into the stories of the violations of these women because most of them come in more acceptable forms, body image, body forms, than Andrea Dworkin herself. And I think that was an interesting kind of insight that came as a consequence of the choice, but it wasn't something that it intended, but I think it's interesting that came up,
Yeah, it's where you land there with that answer, actually, it to me opens up another kind of question about Dworkin and the kind of figure that many people assume they know. And, part of it is I think that, as by creating these other narrators, there is a way in which you defamiliarize Dworkin to people, right? Because I think, as you said, people come to Dworkin already assuming they have some knowledge of her, and that's one sort of cinematic device that helps defamiliarize Dworkin. Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like that also resonates with what you said earlier about, re-experiencing Dworkin through, weirdly, the lens of some of these, like, male creative figures, like, the critic Berger and also the Leonard Cohen, of course, right? But that brings me to, though, why one would want to defamiliarize Dworkin, and that is, of course, obviously the controversy that adheres to, her anti-pornography stance versus, and the kind of infamous sex wars, feminist sex wars of the 80s, et cetera. And so I guess my question is, what are the two, the two parts of it, actually. So the question is, what in the contemporary moment do you think brings us back to Dworkin, given like some of that pushing away as a result of the kind of feminist debates about pornography, etc. Why are we now in a historical moment that is reassessing Dworkin's legacy?
Well, there's lots of things in what you
Big,
said.
I know there's a long,
lots of things,
sprawling
yeah.
set of things, but take which one you want to start with, whichever one.
Well, one of the things I would say is that not to assume that all audiences come to the film knowing who Andrea Dworkin is. And when we premiered at Tribeca last year, there were, of course, in the audience some people who knew of Dworkin, who had engaged with her work, who were around at the time she was around. And then there was a whole swathe of younger people, young women particularly, who didn't really know anything about her, didn't know about the sex wars, didn't know, who she was, or they knew something, but it had been kind of dismissive. And, it was kind of really eye-opening when quite a few of these women came up to me afterwards and said, why didn't we know this feminist writer? Why were we told a different story about her? This story is a revelation. But also there were a couple of young women who came up to me and who said, "You're telling my story. You've told I've never seen my story told in this way. And thank you for telling my story." So I think that, it really kind of reinforced my intent, which was that I was not interested in going into historical debate. I was that was a feminist debate between Andrea Dworkin and pro-sex, anti-sex, all of those debates. I was really interested in making a film that would be useful for women today to talk about rage, to kind of talk about violence against women. She was one of the first few feminists to write in a kind of she eviscerated toxic patriarchy in her writing. And she spoke about battered women because she was a battered woman, as she called herself at the time. And she was one of the first women to actually break that taboo. And I think that, it was much more, for me, it's much more useful to make a film that is actually a tool for us in terms of thinking around these issues now, and to bring it into the contemporary moment. Her outrage and her rage is something that we haven't seen before, and we haven't seen since. And it made me think, something that kind of last year was with Arundhati Roy, and she said something like, let me remember, I think she said something like, how can they expect women to remain balanced in the face of such genocide that is happening to women all over the world? And I kind of think that Andrea Dworkin didn't remain balanced. She provoked, and she spoke the truth, and she paid a high price for it, really.
Yeah, and you can see that just even in the way she delivers, especially in the early '90s, those speeches. And it's not, obviously there's some element of performance to it, but it's not just performative, right? It is, it's a unique ability to tap into the kind of how that affect, that emotion is, always there at the surface.
Yeah.
And that's, and I think that the
She
film
was
really
a
captured
performer,
that.
though. I think,
It's
I mean,
true.
she was truly a performer. She was like an extraordinary orator, and, she was, as Gloria Steinem has said, she was like the Southern preacher, preaching from the hills. And I think she knew she was she had the power. She was very compelling to listen to.
That's why I love the line about, someone told me I could be president of the United States. And we established that early on, that there is, there has to be some form of egoic investment that is that large, that can, allow someone to be that kind of spokesperson, prophet, etc., and to inhabit that role. Well, so, one of the things that I sort of tried to ask you earlier a little bit was about, the different ways that plunging into this topic influenced maybe your approach to maybe filmmaking or making this particular film. But I'm just curious about how you would situate this within your broader oeuvre, like aesthetically, as well as, formally, right? How do you see it? Is it a pivot point in some way? Is it not? What do you see its role amidst your other creations? And is there something that you'll take away from this process that will go into, the next? Because I know that you've always worked in hybrid forms in various ways, but this is obviously with each project it's different. But I invite you to just sort of talk a little bit about that and about your process.
I mean, when I first started to think about my creative approach to this, and I knew, I read as much of Dworkin as I could. I read a lot of her interviews. I listened to a lot of her radio interviews. I watched some of the archival footage. And out of all of that, I wrote a screenplay. I wrote the script. And we shot the dramatizations, and I make this difference. I make a difference between saying that these are dramatizations, they're not reenactments. And for me, the difference is with the dramatizations, we are in the present moment. Reenactments are about being in the past. And I wanted to ensure that the dramatizations brought you into the present moment. And that, I also, with the dramatizations, wanted to kind of hold on certain moments with the actresses where they are breaking the fourth wall and looking back at us as the audience. And, there's a way in which I wanted the frame to just kind of disappear, that we are in there. We're not there as voyeurs. This is not spectacle. And actually asking audiences, what is these are shots that are a mirror for us, so that we have to ask ourselves, how can we allow this to continue? How can we allow these kinds of assaults to continue? That we are all implicated in it. And so that was a slight digression, but in terms of the kind of the formal approach, so I wrote the screenplay, and we shot a lot of it in sort of piecemeal as the funding came. We shot one chapter, then, waited a year to get some more funding. And so it was kind of frustrating to work in that way, but it was kind of forced on us because of resources or lack of resources. And in a way, that was kind of worked out well, because I was able to sit with what I had shot, bring in the archival material, and really experiment with the editing and how it would fit together. And I have to say, there were moments when I thought, oh my God, what have I done? This is not gonna work. This is just not gonna work. This is like crazy. Why did I even think this could actually work? And I did not want, this sort of checkerboard thing of dramatization, archive, dramatization, archive. I kind of wanted a melding of all those different elements. And I think that it was only after we'd shot 2 chapters, the Amandla and Soko chapters, and we needed to do a proof of concept, and I edited half an hour of it, that I thought, okay, I think I could make this work. But it was really nerve-wracking, but I think for me as a filmmaker, as an artist, if you're not taking a risk, then what's the point? For me, it's really important to take creative risks and really push my own boundaries and push my kind of comfort zone, and say, because it would have been easy to do, so much easier to do a conventional kind of biopic, but I just didn't want to do that.
Yeah, and I do think that what you were calling the checkerboard did not happen, especially like having an opportunity to watch it on the big screen tonight. I'd only been able to see it, at home before this, premiere here in Los Angeles. You realize that seamlessness, that enmeshment comes through so well in the film, and you do become lost in it, or you do enter its world instead of being simply a bystander, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted it to be an immersive experience, and for it not to be something that we're like watching as observers, but that's kind of becomes a subjective experience. So that was really important to me, and I think the sound design, the score, everything kind of helped in creating that kind of immersiveness.
Well, I think that we are right at the point, or right very near the point, where we should open the floor up to some questions from the audience, because I'm sure that there are folks who have a lot of curiosities as well. So I believe that, are there ushers who have microphones? There are.
Basically, I'm just saying you really made something happen that I had no idea what this was going to be about when I came. And you made something happen across for all the world's women, their voices in such a way that that's how it came across, not just a personal author's voice or any of that, like you said. And that right there says a lot about human rights. And you had that human right, which is all of us men or women. The women have every much the power to give consent to any actions by men. So I'm 74 years old, and believe me, I've seen a lot of this that you're talking about. And I just wanted to congratulate you on what a wonderful job you did. Thank you.
Thank you.
Extraordinary film. Just totally loved it. I wanted to ask you about the process of gathering the archival and contemporary activism that we saw with women. We were thrilled to see in Mourning and in Rage, which was actually something we participated in the 70s, and we're very familiar with that footage. We're working with it on our own film right now. But to see that and other pieces by women around the world was just, I loved that. And can you talk about the process of gathering that and how you found it and how you decided what to use?
Wow, so you were involved with the Rage and Mourning. Yeah, it was extraordinary footage, and Suzanne Lacey was really generous in allowing me to use it in this film. Part of my kind of intention was to really also show the arc of women activists and artists who have created work that actually deals with this theme of violence against women, and both contemporary and historical, so that, you know, to trace that arc of feminist protest, both on kind of, you know, through individual art, but also collectives of women. You know, Mourning and Rage was one of them. The Argentinian footage was just extraordinary, and you know, that I just sort of felt when we found it, when Shaheen found that, and I looked at it and started working in the edit with it. It sort of really, to me, it was completely evocative of what Andrea Dawkins' words were kind of, you know, so they really went so smoothly together. And it was really kind of thinking about how to, I mean, I was also thinking about artists like Anna Mendieta, and, you know, I wanted to use some of her work, but we didn't have the money to, you know, use it. But that there have been so many women artists who have highlighted and illuminated questions around women's sovereignty over their own bodies, and the kind of violations women's bodies have kind of undergone through patriarchal control, through misogyny. And I wanted to say that this is, Andrea was just not one person, but there were all these other women too who were protesting in their own different ways. What film are you making?
It's called Acting Like Women, and it's about feminist performance art in 1970s to 80s Los Angeles.
Great.
Excited.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the footage of Andrea's personal life, and I know you didn't want to dig too deep into the biography, but I also know she identified as a lesbian. Is there a reason that kind of identity was left out of this movie?
No, there's no reason. I think that what I understood was that she identified as a lesbian as a political definition, because she took on that identity not in defense of, in support of lesbians. But in her personal life, she was completely and totally devoted to John. She spent 30 years of her life with him, right up until the end of her life. And as you could see, she speaks about him as the love of her life. So I think that for me, that was kind of, it was there. That was the fact. And her political allegiance to lesbians by calling herself lesbian at a very particular moment in time, because she didn't do that throughout her life. She only did that one particular moment. To me, that was not an important part of her narrative.
There's always that the phrase of, of feminism is the politics, lesbianism is the practice, right? So I think that's sort of that was the follow through in that identification of that particular era.
Yeah.
Even if the practice was still just a political affiliation, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a good question to ask at every screening. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, but I mean, I also, I guess, just in case people are still percolating a little bit on their questions, I can throw in a little bit of a follow up around that, and around the the home movie stuff. I mean, I know that's very kind of like a basic question to ask, but it's sort of like, well, how did you decide, like, in what ways did you access it? How did you access it? And in what ways did you decide, or like make the decision around how much of it to incorporate, right? Because I think that it is really stunning to have that archive. Now everybody's births are archived on Instagram or what have you, right? Every step and every moment of whatever you had for lunch, et cetera. And but obviously with figures who, had most of their lives in the 20th century, it's different.
Yeah, no, I mean, that footage is fantastic, and there was about half an hour of that footage. It's never been used before. I mean, how fabulous that Andrea had an uncle who loved Super 8 cameras, and he recorded a lot of their kind of family gatherings over the years. And so John Stoltenberg, who holds the rights to Andrea's estate, showed it to me, and I was like, I have to use this because it's so important. I felt it was just really important to see the Andrea, the baby Andrea, the teenage Andrea. I mean, it stops when she's a teenager, but to kind of really locate her within her family and her own particular extended family. And just to sort of, she was so deeply loved by her father and her mother, but really by her father. She was extremely close to her father. And I think the texture of the footage is just brings alive, and it's about this, the Andrea Dworkin people knew later on, this was the Andrea Dworkin this is where she started, this is who she was. And I think part of it, I hadn't realized this, but I think part of it, as we go through the film, we see the way in which her body changes over time. And she really took on the brunt of a lot of the attacks on her, and took it on so that her body became her armor. And also, her experience of sexual abuse, many women who, and this is not a generalization, this is speaking to, therapists and psychologists, many women who have been sexually abused do put on weight as a way to create an armor for themselves. And I think that, one of the things that I often get asked is, well, why isn't there anything in the film about her size and her weight. And I was like, but that's just so obvious. It's there, we see her. And so why make it an issue? The fact that she was vilified because of the way she looked a lot of the times, because of the fact that she didn't make any concessions to femininity. She was like, male writers are never asked why they wear the clothes they wear, whether they wash their hair or not. I just want to be a writer and to be seen as a writer. And so that's when she donned the uniform of the overalls, So on that.
There's a hand over in this aisle, I think, and there's.
Hi, I would like you to speak about why you selected the title and why not Andrea Dworkin.
So you mean my name is Andrea? I think it was kind of really in line with my kind of conceptual, formal approach to the storytelling, so that all these women are called Andrea. And it was to kind of break apart the singularity of a particular story. So using Andrea's story, but to kind of extrapolate to other kind of bodies who experience similar, have had similar experiences. And I kind of wanted to open it up in that way. And I think that by just calling it Andrea Dworkin, there would be a certain kind of expectation of it being a certain kind of biography, and that's not what I was doing.
I'm curious about your ending with the quote, 24-hour choose. I haven't read Andrea's work, but I've read like Angela Davis and Bell Hooks, all the other feminist scholars. So I was just curious if there's any, I'm sure there's different interpretations about the choose, given like the current circumstances with around like Me Too movement and Roe v. Wade and all of those. Are they like kind of related, or like I'm just curious why you select the ending with the quote? Yeah, thank you.
So if I understand that correctly, so why did I end with that speech she made? I don't know if it was clear, but that speech was made. She made that speech to a conference, a men's conference. A group, there were over 500 men, and she was the only woman there. And she gave that speech to those men. I think that, when I read that speech and when I heard her voice, because there's only a recording of it, there was no only an audio recording of it. And when I heard it, I just thought that it was just so powerful. And that it really is a kind of what's the word? It's not a kind of mission statement, but it's like a call to arms. It's like saying, okay, what are we going to do? Can we have a 24-hour truce on rape? And it's kind of almost symbolic and metaphorical because we can't. It's like rape is happening every few seconds all over the world. But I think that it's a kind of a polemical, didactic, kind of rhetorical speech that I find really quite rousing, in that it makes me want to go out and be like, what can I do? What can I practically do to try and change the situation? And I think that that's part of my intent, is to sort of say, to make people feel like, okay, how can any one of us do something to change this?
I think that's a really great place actually to end, is the, inducement to think about what can I do? Yeah. What can I do to change this? And, from Andrea's final words in the film that you created to induce that, I think that that's how we should part from the premiere of My Name is Andrea tonight. So please, once again, thank you to the Hammer, thank you to the Billy Wilder Theater, and everyone who supported us here, and everyone associated with